Hello and welcome. Today we'll be discussing paywalls, specifically the relationship between paywalls and news. Paywalls are essentially virtual walls that restrict someone's access to online content. The only way you can access the content then is through some sort of paid subscription. In order to really understand the complexities of paywalls, we'll briefly review some of the history of news. In the past, you had to pay for your papers at the local newsstands. During print and broadcast days, media companies controlled their own content and distribution. So we see people picking up the newspaper at the newsstand and signing up for magazine subscriptions. Then the penny press was created. The cost of newspapers was able to go down because newspapers began working with advertisers to gain their revenue. This is where we notice the birth of mass media. With the birth of the internet, many things went online. At first, specifically in the 2000s, more of newspapers' digital content was free. Many people were still purchasing printed newspapers. In the 2010s, more and more people turned to the internet to gather all their news, so fewer people were buying physical newspapers. Because of the nature of the internet, newspapers were able to truly become a media for the masses. They could reach as wide of an audience as possible. This free content was helpful for newspapers because they could build social awareness and prestige for their website. With content moving online, it doesn't cost as much to provide this news. There's no cost to print or deliver newspapers. So we see advertisers paying publishers with much ease in that there's not as much expenses to pay for, which is why a lot of content has stayed free. Unfortunately, publishers aren't making as much money as they thought they would from advertisers. So paywalls are being instituted to help journalists get paid. As we know is true on the internet, anyone can publish anything. So we see a lot of really good news content being published and wildly accessible, but we also run the risk of bad news content being available and people reading lies and inaccurate information on the internet. As the internet has continued to evolve, we see that publishers are losing control over their own content and distribution, relying more heavily on big tech companies like Google and Facebook, and therefore Google and Facebook are getting most of the ad revenue. Now, with some understanding about the history of news, we can see that newspapers operate in a really unique way in that they cater to two very different groups that are both mutually dependent on each other, advertisers and readers. Right now, advertisers provide newspapers with more revenue than readers offer newspapers. So we see papers wanting to reach out as wildly as possible because that's what advertisers want. They want their ads to be seen by as many people as possible, and that's what newspapers do then. This affects the newspaper's content. In order for content to be relevant for the masses, it must to some degree be general and applicable to the average person. The audience size also directly impacts advertisements, which impacts publishers' income. When reporting is built around ads like this, more articles become clickbait articles, and that's more likely to be low quality. These ad-heavy articles end up bringing in the money, which is why we see them so often. Readers could be considered the newspaper's main currency. Newspapers operate to create content that will be read, and advertisers create ads that people see. Readers decide what news to read based on the time and money it takes. People decide to use these resources based on what they expect to get in return. Expending these resources also depends on the costs associated with consumption, also known as the opportunity cost. This means that the cost of reading news increases when paywalls are put in place because it costs more money to access the content. Paywalls can lead newspapers' content to rely heavily on what people want. When news becomes focused commercially on what people want and what people are willing to pay for, news becomes softer. This results in content focused on consumption, production, and entertainment. Soft news is the opposite of hard news, where hard news is news about politics and other complex issues. The proportion of hard news decreases when commercial logic rules. Because newspapers cater to their readers to get ad revenue, many of their guiding questions have turned from hard news focused who, what, where, when, why to soft news focused who cares about this and how much are they willing to pay for this information. These are the questions now determining what becomes news. There are several different types of paywalls, each operate differently, but all of these types ultimately serve the same function, to create revenue for news publishers. A hard paywall is when a section of the online content is closed and only available to subscribers. This type is not as common because when readers hit hard paywalls, they'll usually go look somewhere else for information. Because of this, there's a high risk of losing customers. Because of this risk, fewer advertisers are interested in this space. So hard paywalls run the risk of losing readers and losing advertisers, making them tricky to navigate, which is likely why they're not as common. Two organizations that operate with hard walls well include the Wall Street Journal and British Times. Soft paywalls is when free content is offered, but readers have to pay for the premium content. This means that viewers can access and read a lot of information, but select articles are only visible for paying customers. The popular columnist content is usually what's behind these paywalls. This is commonly called a freemium model or premium paywall model. Metered paywalls is when readers get access to a select number of articles per time period. For example, someone would get access to 3 free articles per 1 week. Cookies on our devices help keep track of this information. Once the limit has been met, a user will either wait until the next week to access content from that particular site or purchase a subscription to read the paywalled information. The New York Times is an example of an organization that does metered paywalling very well. Dynamic paywalls adapt to users' personal website behavior. Publishers can then use and evaluate that data on returning customers and user profiles. This means that users who come back frequently, so multiple times a day, will get hit with paywalls sooner. However, if you only visit a site a few times a week, you'll continue to have free content. The paywall is essentially calculating the probability of a particular reader to pay for a subscription based on collected data. The challenge for publishers then is to create and deliver content that readers find valuable enough to come back for. The New You magazine is an example that does this really well. The final type of paywall is voluntary donations. This is when readers voluntarily donate money to a particular site. Usually this is accessible through a sidebar option that would then link to funding options. This is the most unobtrusive payment model, and readers can freely engage with all content. The Guardian is an example of an organization that operates in this way of voluntary donations. Now we'll discuss some positive effects of paywalls. Creators, writers, and journalists need to be appropriately compensated for their work. Paywalls help do that, which is really beneficial. Many other benefits of paywalls affect publishers. Subscriptions based around regular access to a product provide a regular and recurring source of income, so subscribers to a specific news source provide consistent revenue for that news source. Digital subscriptions provide more user data, which allows ads to be further catered to readers. News publishers can then make more money through ads because of this personalization. Contrastly, paywalls allow companies to decrease their reliance on ad markets because they're getting revenue from their readers. Consequently, paywalls tend to create a more intimate and loyal customer relationship. With a smaller, loyal pool of subscribers, publishers can focus on content and mediums that matter to their audience. This benefits readers because there's a higher likelihood they'll be reading what they're actually interested in reading about. While there are real positive effects to paywalls, there are also real negative consequences to paywalls that we must be aware of. One of the really identifiable negative effects of paywalls is that maintaining them takes a lot of work. You could also argue that they're not effective because there's a lot of ways to get around paywalls and find information that isn't behind those walls. Asking people to pay for online news from one single provider tends to feel old-fashioned and out of sync because we now experience and expect multiplicity and choice because of the internet. Paywalls also decrease word of mouth when it's used as a marketing strategy. This potentially affects the news branding in a negative way. It also negatively affects people's ability to share news. Paywalls don't make sense to publishers if they don't have large loyal audiences because many people don't want to pay for news and they'll go somewhere else. In order for publishers to keep their audience and make money, they must pass the value for money threshold. This means that audience members have to find value in this particular news source to stick around and purchase the paywall. A consequence of hard paywalls is the decrease of overall number of website viewers. When paywalls are introduced in one research from 2013, cited on the screen, they found that the overall visits to a website fell by 51%. Readership among 18 to 24-year-olds falls by 99%. This means that 18 to 24-year-olds are much less likely to pay for news. The shift away from younger readers can be associated with a decline in political participation. With this shift in readership, comprehensive community is not happening. Newspaper readership is an important part of democracy and civic engagement, so this is problematic. Another factor with heavy consequences is that those with lower income aren't able financially to pay for premium content. The same research from 2013 cited on the screen found that readership from users with incomes below $30,000 a year drops 91%, while visits from users making above $100,000 a year declines only 51%. This shows that those making less than $30,000 a year are more at risk when paywalls are put in place. Ultimately, we can see paywalls are creating rigid class systems that discriminate people's access to news and information based on how much money they're making. An important negative consequence of paywalls is the presence of echo chambers and digital bubbles. Most readers read several publications, though they're not likely to purchase more than 1 or 2 subscriptions. People are less likely to pay for news that they don't agree with or news that challenges their opinions. Additionally, opinions are usually formed by the amount of content read, not necessarily the quality of content. So we can see public opinion being molded with some ease. Similar to how social media filter bubbles operate, paywalls could lead to publications creating even more division as they become more partisan. Joshua Line, a part of the Epic Presence team cited on the screen, writes, "If news ends up moving away from the open web, and if we all align ourselves to outlets that fit our worldview, are we not in danger of isolating ourselves from each other and splintering our realities further?" It's worth considering also that if some news publications have paywalls and others don't, many people will likely end up on the free version, and that creates an echo chamber as well. Because we're noticing a lot more inaccurate or low quality information being free, this is especially problematic. The vital and reliable information could become least accessible, leaving those who can't afford high quality information without some really important information. As mentioned before, right now many people choose not to pay for news because they can access the information freely on other sites, even if they have to go to several places. However, the reality is, and the trends that we're seeing as demonstrated on the screen, is that more and more publishers are instituting paywalls, meaning we won't be able to get our news for free anymore. This trend is also seen in European countries. Most of the news publishers that are finding paywalls to be successful are large publishers. So we'll notice other publishing companies wanting to apply these paywalls, some with more or less success. So we're seeing a lot of inconsistency in the application of paywalls right now. Really specific publishers tend to stick with hard paywalls, whereas more general interest focused publishers often have metered paywalls. Currently, one-time payments for a single edition, single donation, or one-time bundle are most common versus ongoing subscriptions for news. Interestingly, people are more likely to pay for online video, audio, and mobile apps than online news. Specifically, individuals in the emerging adulthood category are least likely to pay for news. Right now, we see one of the biggest reasons people pay for news online is to have access to news on their smartphones or tablets. Some research in 2016 writes that most paywalls are dynamic, socio-technical systems that reveal institutional patterns, journalistic rituals, and news values. So this looks like that's where we are now, understanding more of the structures behind news, how the internet fits into that, and also what effect people have on the news. Sometimes during major current events, advertisements are interrupted as they appear uncivic, think 9/11, or paywalls will be dropped because information is super necessary, think COVID. This suggests that the public value of news is sometimes incompatible with its market value. So we're seeing the US needing to balance public missions and market forces when it comes to news. As news has become more commercial, shareholders and stockholders have had a greater influence on journalists. This focused pursuit on revenues, though, could lead journalism to become more partisan. This gets confusing when we see the value of news changing, in that sometimes it's free and sometimes it's not. So this is another component to be aware of as news operates as both a public good and a market good. So what can we expect? Research is still showing that most people are unlikely to pay for news in the future. This is especially true when content is general and therefore easily replaceable. Despite this, editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, says, "Paywalls are the only future for journalism. If the quality of writing is good enough, then people will pay." Because of this, we'll likely be seeing more paywalls in the future. This could very likely bring more competition among publishers as customers have limited spending ability on new subscriptions. Traditional paywalls probably won't work, so we'll likely see metered or hybrid paywalls in the form of micropayments, membership programs, and user data exchanges. One huge question that gets to the root of paywalls is who should be paying for quality journalism? Some argue that journalism is a public good and therefore should be available and accessible to everyone. Others argue that big tech companies should pay for news since they're the ones getting rich off of it. But most of the research points to consumers paying for news because it can help keep publications more independent. So it looks like readers will have to pay. Because of the unique way news operates in its field, it's important for you as a future professional operating in this industry to be aware of the many forces at play. I encourage you all to build self-awareness for what you personally and professionally want to stand for, and also pay attention to what your future employers stand for. Thank you.